New update dropped and quite a few characters got changes that just honestly completely reworks the character you've been playing for months. So, there's no better time to drift away from stinky public builds that hardly speak to your playstyle and instead take matters into your own hands. Hello ladies and gents, I'm the Dapper Rat, master of all 4 elements, and I've been creating my own builds since the alpha playtest launched. So, what better time for me than now to teach you all that I know. First things first, every character starts off with a different amount of stats that improve with each boon you gather. Boons are Deadlock's version of a leveling system. Once you reach a certain amount of souls, you gain a boon from your patron, which improves your stats by a certain amount. I can't exactly be too specific by how much, since every character also gains different effects from their boons. You can check what your character gets by hovering over this flask icon. What I can't be specific about though is the ability unlock and level up tokens. These tokens, as described, are what you use to unlock and level up your abilities. Important for a build crafter, as the order you upgrade abilities can change drastically based on what your build is trying to succeed at doing. Now then, there's 3 main categories that affect your character's stats: spirit, vitality, and weapon. All of which you can see in the bottom left by hovering over one of these bars. These categories display nearly all your stats from the DPS of your gun to your resistances, so if you ever get curious about your damage output or what certain items debuff/buff could affect, you can likely find the change here. It's important to note that stats, abilities, and even items can scale with different attributes. What determines if something scales is if there's a sigil with a small arrow pointing out of it. The sigil tells you what the attribute scales with, and holding left alt on your keyboard will tell you by how much. Your player icon signifies that it scales with boons, meaning each time you get a boon, the attribute that scales off of it will increase. A purple star signifies spirit power scaling, of which you can find your spirit power in the bottom left when looking at your spirit stats. An orange target signifies weapon damage scaling, of which you can find your weapon damage in the top right of your weapon stats. It's important to note that weapon scaling abilities scale with weapon damage as a whole number and not as a percentage. As an example, Venator's Gut Shot scales at a 1x multiplier with 60 base damage. If you purchase Glass Cannon, this does not grant you 80% more damage, making it 108, but rather adds the base damage to the percent as a whole number multiplied by the scaling multiplier, thus giving you 140. It's also important to note that the number that appears in your DPS and abilities only sometimes is based on the weapon damage percent, and other times does not incorporate conditional effects from items like point blank. Finally, an orange fist signifies melee damage scaling, of which you can find your light and heavy melee damage at the bottom of the weapon stats. Any abilities will scale based off of the light melee damage unless stated otherwise, like in Viscus's tier 3 Puddle Punch upgrade, which says minus 12-second cooldown and now does heavy melee damage. Somewhat moving on, we need to talk about investments, but not the stock market kind. See, as you purchase items, they build up your investment towards one of 3 categories. Once you hit an investment goal, you gain a stat buff. Buying orange items will build up your weapon investment, granting additional weapon damage. Purple grants spirit investment for additional spirit power, and green is a vitality investment for extra HP. As you purchase items, it costs more and more to reach the next investment goal, meaning there is diminishing returns. However, certain goals, like the one at 4.8 thousand souls, which is the equivalent of a tier 3 and tier 2 item, grant an additional bonus for the amount invested. This means that unless you're doing a hyper-specific build, you often want to at least spend 4.8 thousand souls in all categories to get that nice hike in investment to soul cost ratio. Pricing is everything, and as such, structuring your build to a certain min-max is quite effective, with the exception of hard carries like 7 and Haze. I would make a build around the 50k mark due to you gaining your max amount of boons at this soul level, and should be more than able to tidy up a match around this strength. Other timelines I use include 5 to 7k souls for items before you lose or win your lane, about 15k for when all lanes have lost their guardians but before any lane has lost a walker, about 35k by the time all walkers are down, and obviously 50k as a soft max for when you should be more than capable of ending the game. You can still add items to your build after this point, but your strength at different parts of the match should be based on a more realistic amount of souls to acquire. Now then, let's get into the theory of actually making a build. The first thing to decide is what you want your build to be centered around. That could range from tanking a lot of damage, or supporting allies, or doing retarded amounts of damage, or stopping players from being allowed to play the game for an extended period of time like an asshole. Needless to say, you must make a choice, and this choice should be based on your character. Now, depending on who you play, you could theoretically build anything or be shoehorned into one singular viable build. Gun characters are boring, but bad taste aside, you must make a choice. I have a document, link in description, that I keep updated with different playstyles and attributes that characters tend to have that you can lean into. These attributes are the pillars of range, the delegations of work, and the features of a kit. The pillars of range include poke, brawl, and dive. Poke signifies a character meant to operate at longer ranges, brawl signifies a character that can sustain through longer fights, and dive signifies a character with high mobility that can weave in and out of conflict. The delegations of work are tank, pick, flanker, support, and DPS. Tanks are the punching bag, meant to force abilities and items out of enemies by taking them straight to the dome. Picks are displacement experts that punish players for staying a little too far from safety. Flankers often thrive in 1v1s and as such are meant to take advantage of chaos during a fight to secure kills. Supports, as the name implies, aid their team by disabling enemies and enabling allies, while DPS do server admin levels of damage. Finally, the features of a kit is what your character can do that isn't just damage the enemy. Disruptors often force enemy teams to split apart, making them easier to pick off. Light CC suggests enemies to move, soft CC force enemies to move or not move, and hard CC stops enemies from playing in some fashion. AoE is simply anything that can affect multiple players at once within an area, with finally buffer and debuffer either buff their allies or debuff their enemies. You could always hybridize your build, doing many of these things at once, but the more you do ultimately makes each individual thing less effective in general. Still, if you solo queue, sometimes you have teammates that can't properly communicate your build to, and as such, some light hybridization is needed. But with that being said, let's get into actually making a build. Okay, so it's a little hard to make a video that covers the niche of every character, their playstyles and abilities, so I have to trust that you understand how your character works and are ready to use a little critical thinking. Generally speaking though, to make a build, you start off with your form of interaction. The three main ways to interact with the game is through your gun, your abilities, or your melee. Then your choice of range, work, and features influence your itemization. As an example, Vindicta is a poke range character who does the work of a support DPS hybrid with hard CC, debuffing, and AoE features in her kit. Along with this, her main source of interaction is her gun. Items also tend to have their own categories besides the obvious spirit, vitality, and weapon. Some items are debuff items whilst others increase your raw damage, but some items exist purely to bolster the strength your kit already has. Items that extend duration or range often don't make your kit directly stronger, but rather makes it easier to use or rather harder to ignore. Going back to our Vindicta example, her crow already applies a significant amount of resistance shred when upgraded. As such, a build around crow would actually avoid items like crippling headshot and instead try to bolster other effects of the crow. Escalating exposure can proc multiple times off of the crow, duration extender can make it last longer, the nuance of making a build is quite endless. To try one last time to break it down as simply as possible though, you investigate your character for their forms of interaction and choose one. Then you rationalize what their different abilities do and choose one or two as the centers of your build. You then bolster and improve these abilities through your itemization and voila, you have crafted a build, but now you kinda need to put it together. So I usually start structuring a build by creating 4 main categories. Early game lane phase for items I aim to get before losing my guardian, early game roam phase for items I aim to get after the lane is lost/won but before a walker has fallen, mid game for items before all walkers have fallen but obviously after all guardians are gone, and finally late game for items after all walkers have been taken. It's important to note though that these categories are more so guidelines. Not every match plays at the same pace, which could lead to teams steamrolling the patron before hitting 30k souls, or both teams biding their time and farming for big 45k soul pushes on walkers that are somehow still standing. For ease of clarity, I put all my purchase tier 1 items in lane phase, all my purchase tier 2s in roam phase, tier 3s in mid game, and tier 4s in late game. At this point, we have to determine power spikes and flex slots. Some items give way more value in both investment and or effectiveness than others, leading you to alter the placement of these items in different areas. For example, Tesla bullets, the tier 3 that leads into capacitor, have nearly the same amount of damage per shock, and as such, I can put Tesla bullets earlier for a stronger gun early on, and then hold off on getting capacitor until way later into the match. Alternatively, Boundless Spirit can grant an entire kit huge spikes in damage, so Boundless Spirit can potentially come earlier than other items despite being so expensive. This part is mainly trial and error mixed with a bit of critical thinking, finding out which items are more effective than others at different soul levels and what items are important but not enough to warrant being part of the base build and should instead be regulated to a flex slot. Not to mention that each category should follow the purchasing goals I stated earlier, 5 to 7 for lane, 15 for roam, 35 for mid, and 50k plus for late game. You can find your different damage / utility levels by individually giving yourself boons equal to your build cost at that item. This is what lets you trial and error potency in the training range, but to find out effectiveness you will need to play a match. It's also at this point we can designate when a flex item is important to get and add other notes for the purpose of an item or potentially multiple items that can be swapped out for each other. Once you have everything laid out, you can add an extra slot for lane items that you might want. Healing Right is an easy addition for every character, but don't ignore items like Restorative Shot, Mystic Regen, Extra Regen, Monster Rounds, or Extended Mag. It really depends on a per character basis. You can also chuck an extra category for if the match draws out longer than expected for builds to exceed 50,000. And with that, it's as simple as testing your build in a match, seeing what was getting a lot of value and what wasn't, then tweaking your build over time. And so I've taught you all that I know. If you enjoyed, like, comment, and subscribe. The playlist on the left will teach you more about Deadlock if you wish to improve, while the video on the right is statistically the most interesting thing you can watch right now, so long as YouTube hasn't lost its mind. Thank you all for watching. I've been the Dapper Rat, and as always, farewell, ladies and gents.